Hi, and welcome back to ConTinual. We're going to try this all one more time. So this is about the second time we've tried to record this particular panel on LitRPG. So if you can get lost in your campaign, you can get lost when you're in the video as well. So tonight, before we get started, I'm Jim Nettles. I will be your host, and I'm going to go around the room and let everyone introduce themselves. So Emily, I'm going to let you go first.
Hello, I am Emily Kaplan. I write under the name E.M. Kaplan, and I'm having deja vu. I am mostly known for my humorous Josie Tucker mysteries, but for the purposes of this panel, I am also the author of Fandango the Fantastical, the origin story, which I co-wrote with John Hartness, and it's his character on the Authors and Dragons podcast. And I've also co-written a Brandon Thighmaster story with Steve Wetherell, who is also on the Authors and Dragons podcast.
Paul?
Hey, I'm Paul Barrett. I'm a writer, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be on here. Also a filmmaker, film technician. My daytime job when I'm not writing is doing either props or script supervisor for motion picture or television projects. My novels include a fantasy series, The Necromancer Saga, and a comedy, I guess I call it Elmore Leonard meets J.R.R. Tolkien. It's the Spade Case Files, which involves a dwarf detective and his lizard man sidekick.
Rachel.
Hi, I am Rachel Carr, but like most women nowadays, I write under R.E. Carr. Not that most women write under R.E. Carr. We just use our initials, particularly if you write science fiction and fantasy like I do. I am the author of the Rules Undying series, the False Icon series, and the reason I am here is because, one, I run a D&D podcast that has Emily in it, part of Authors and Dragons, and I wrote my first LitRPG book, Girl, that is Guy in Real Life, last year for the Shingles series. And I'm a massive gamer and geek.
And Larry.
Hey, y'all. I'm Larry Martin, author and oftentimes co-author with my wife, partner in life and work, Gail Z. Martin. For tonight, the book that I wrote that's relevant is The Splintered Crown. It's a portal quest adventure set in a gaming universe with the VIN numbers filed off. I also have a space opera, Salvage Rat, and then with Gail, we have a number of series, including the Storm and Fury Adventures, Spell, Salt, and Steel, which is a Monster Hunter series, a post-apocalyptic series called The Wasteland Marshals. And we also have another series in the Shadow Council archives, which is based on Joe Majorak.
So let's kind of dive into the idea. What is LitRPG? How do you define it? I mean, so we know that there's a bit of gaming involved. We know that there's a bit of writing involved in characters. So just sort of going around the room, let's talk about how you define LitRPG and how you like to interpret LitRPG. So Emily, I'm gonna let you go first. Well,
As I recall, in our previous panel, which no longer exists out in ether, we had a fabulous panelist that you will have to imagine is here in spirit, because I'm actually really new to the D&D world. I only started playing late in life in my 40s, thanks to the podcast and to Rachel there. But I think it's any story that has to do with gameplay, even tangentially, like the ones that I've written, which use some of the mechanics of gameplay, but are mostly focused on where these characters came from that actually exist in games.
And Paul?
Yeah, I think it's sort of, at least my interpretation of it, or as I understand it, is kind of, it is taking the world of gaming and the characters in the story may or may not realize they're in a game world, but it's, you can sort of tell where the world comes from or what's happening and why it's happening. It can also, to me, involve people who are playing a game and suddenly get sucked into the world that they're playing, so that they become either their characters or they themselves become characters in the world that they've been brought into as their selves.
And R.E. Carr.
Oh, nerd alert! I'm coming in. I would say that, like, if you're actually defining like the most hardcore definition of the genre, it's very much like the isekai anime. It is person sucked in either just their mind or literally sucked into a game world. It has a big emphasis on the rules and structure, and unlike most books where you want world building to kind of fade into the background, the world often becomes a character of its own and is very prominent. And half of the fun of LitRPG is basically taking it apart and seeing how it's designed. So it's pretty much equal parts game design and writing. And it's become immensely popular in the past few years, but it's also a feature a lot in anime and in video games as well. Yes, there are video games where you get sucked into a video game if that doesn't like get you into the Inception mode.
And Larry, anything you want to add to that?
I think it does run the spectrum from the narrative of an actual gameplay where you can see the rules playing out in what's written, all the way back to where I started, which was with the Forgotten Realms series by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, which was based on a gaming system, and everyone knew it was based on a gaming system, but it was written more as a traditional epic fantasy.
So I want to kind of start with how you got introduced to the idea of lit RPG, you know, beyond just fantasy or science fiction or that realm. So for me, you know, the first couple things I remember were things like the Tron movie or the D&D cartoon, you know, and that's the original Tron movie, you know, back when they were still going for the really cool special effects. So for you guys, what was it that introduced you to the idea of lit RPG? What attracted you to it? So Paul, we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, the first thing I kind of remember is probably the D&D cartoon, because that's sort of this is kind of the I mean, that to me it was sort of the genesis of it. As near as I can remember, I suspect there were things before that involved, although near as I can remember, before Dungeons and Dragons and that sort of thing, gaming in and of itself was you know, Monopoly and Risk, unless you were European, in which case there were different games. Like then the Avalon Hill games sort of became big, but gaming when we were young isn't what it is now, I don't think. So yeah, probably the D&D cartoon is the first thing I can really remember sort of taking me into that kind of idea that the game, that you can go into the game in real life, for lack of a better way to put it.
What about you, Rachel?
Well, I'm old enough. The D&D cartoon was my jam too. But I remember things like in video games, there's stuff like Ultima, and some of those, all the classic RPGs where you were sort of building a character and playing in it. That's more where I started, and I did a lot of anime. So you got Dot Hack, Sword Art Online, even though that's newer, but it's a very good example of the genre. And obviously I read the Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman books because I was a huge nerd, and I was the girl who went into my brother's bedroom and stole his D&D Dungeon Master's Guide and taught myself D&D when I was like 6, because that's what nerd kids do. So I started young and just devoured as much as I could.
Did he make you roll for initiative?
Actually, he just let them sit on his shelf. So while I was going through his Iron Maiden records and all that, I just took it. I don't know how long it took him to notice. I had to play first edition as a little kid. Nobody cares about encumbrance rules when you're tiny. Everything's encumbrance.
Nobody cares about encumbrance rules if you're not tiny. I don't know anybody who ever used those stupid things.
You never had a chemistry teacher as a DM, clearly.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
What about you, Larry?
Yeah, well, my first thought is the phrase from my daughter and I used to play a video game, and what echoed through my head when Rachel was just talking is, I can't carry anymore.
That and Warrior shot the food.
But I'll date myself even further and say I spent a lot of my youth in this place that used to be called Dalton Books. I know none of you have heard of that. Or Walden.
Yes,
The Dalton books.
B.
Oh, yeah.
Dalton.
Beat
Oh,
all.
yeah.
And that's where I bought my first Dungeons and Dragons set in a box. And from that point, that's where I discovered the genre, was because every time I went in the store, which was frequently since there wasn't anything else to do at the time, was looking for anything on the shelf they put with it, which might have been Guardians of the Flame or When the Forgotten Realm or later when Driz series came out. But that's where I really started, was with the books they put on the shelf that had that nice little tie-in symbol on it. I said, oh, this is in my world. And that's where I started.
So let's talk a little bit about the difference between writing in LitRPG versus, writing the things that we would, I won't say normally write, but some of the other genres we write in. Because I mean, one of the biggest things we've already started talking about is you're kind of establishing the rules, and the rules present much more visibly, I think, than a lot of the time you would see in some other systems. So, Ms. Carr, for you, how is it you think that the rules need to be seen? Is it more of inherent? Is it more of, do you crack the jokes about, it seems like 2 times out of 5, I just seem to fall flat on my face.
Oh, when I did it, I went like, if you're going to go, just dive straight into the deep end. So I had you got to think of different ways to say plus 25 XP. And in your mind, everyone's reading the robot voice. I can't wait to hear it in audio because I'm expecting just robot, like a slightly British accent robot voice needs to be reading all this. But no, it's a lot of, how can I put it? I like the granular detail. I think if you're gonna, you have to do one thing. You need to be very sly, very clever, very subtle, or you just need to, boom, vomit it all out like a Jackson Pollock painting and put it all out there. And the best / worst part is it's arbitrary. It's like math homework. You're showing your work. So as long as you're consistent with it, it's easy because you can just sort of read back through and go, okay, this is this and this. I had spreadsheets. Who has spreadsheets for a 20,000 word novella? This girl. But yeah, it's definitely I think you have to make the decision if you want to be clever or if you just want to put it all out there, because if you kind of go in the middle, it can get muddled and confused. And that is definitely one of the pitfalls of the genre, is you have to decide, and you don't have to just be consistent with characters, you have to be consistent with a world, and the world itself becomes a character.
You can tell Rachel's an accountant.
Spreadsheets. Oh yeah. Just don't ask me till after tax time.
What about you, Larry?
Well, first I will say that all epic fantasy requires a spreadsheet. It's just a given. But I think for us, and now writing with Gail, I certainly only know a couple of genres, but I'd say what I focused on with the more gaming book was having it consistent with the rules, because mine is not a traditional RPG, because I'm not going into all the details and showing the reader that I rolled or how many hit points or what my armor class is. So it's more of a traditional fantasy book, but it's set in a world. So there you're giving a nod to it. Okay, anytime you start with an adventure party of 5 people and you have a thief, one is going to assume, oh, wait, what's this tied to? So you've got to be consistent with your gaming world, because as soon as they start reading and they see both the creatures you've included and how the characters interact and how they each play on their own skills, you've got to make sure you're consistent with that world, and that you at least give a nod to it, even if you've scrubbed the VIN numbers off and you've alluded to the rules rather than putting them out directly. And I think that's what's different than a traditional, say, fantasy book, is keeping those rules and giving those nods, even if it's in your characters and how they interact or how you talk about how they place themselves or who's doing what when.
What About you, Emily?
Well, as with any other genre, you have to know your audience, and the audience for these books are people who play and know rules. So if you're going to build a world that is rule based or based on a rule based game, then your audience is going to appreciate that. So you should be consistent.
Anything you want to?
On the other hand, if you're going to play loose and fast and do it in a humorous way, then you can do it very lightly, I think.
Comedy helps. Comedy kind of brushes over some of the hardcoreness.
Yeah.
And I think most RPG almost requires some comedy.
What about you, Paul? Anything you want to pile on that?
No, I mean, everybody's kind of covered it. I think it does sort of come down to, unfortunately, now for better or worse, if you write fantasy, readers, I think, to a certain extent, are going to try and figure out what game system you're pulling it from, or what world you're drawing off of. And it's kind of come full circle, because I remember when you first got the DMG or the Player's Handbook, in the back there was that whole bibliography of the things that inspired Gygax. Jack Vance obviously being a big one. That's basically where the magic system came from. So we're kind of circling back to, okay, what are we stealing from the game, and what are we doing to hide the fact that we're doing that, or are we? So I think you do have to sort of, if you're going to go with the game system, you have to go, okay, I'm going to go with it, and I'm going to let people know what it is. So if my wizard casts a fireball, then he's not also going to be able to cast, wish, if he's indicated that he's a third level, or I don't remember. It's been a while, but I don't remember what level wizard casts fireball. But you can't be fifth. Thank you. But you can't be inconsistent in that respect if you've sort of indicated to your audience that you're running on a specific system. You can't have a fighter suddenly fling fireball without indicating that he is in fact he's a fighter mage. So otherwise people are going to yell at you.
And they will yell. They yell. And in a previous life in this panel, in like the alternate reality, there's one other important thing that I think Larry mentioned, that if you're scrubbing the VIN numbers off a system, you have to do it really well, because you should definitely know the legality of what is copyrighted and trademarked in a world.
That's actually the next
like
place
some
I want.
monsters.
Yeah.
This place, you know what I'm talking about. I won't finish that statement, but they have tentacles and they look like pumas. Those are actually copyrighted.
Well, that's actually one of the
DVDs are
things.
copyrighted?
Oh, wow. Really?
I didn't know that.
That's actually one of the things I was hoping we were going to dive into more tonight, because we didn't go too heavy on it, even though we had the one and only Judy Black, who writes for many of these game systems.
He does.
And we're missing her this evening. But so, Larry, you've talked a couple of times about filing off the VIN numbers. Intellectual property is one of those things that is near and dear to my heart. I frequently deal with both sides of it. So as we're looking at IP, how do you file the VIN numbers off enough to stay out of trouble? And how do you really decide what systems you want to work with and how closely you want to work to somebody's system, unless you're writing in a licensed property?
Well, I think, one, if you are writing in any licensed property, you need to understand the company and their rules before you even start, because depending upon the gaming system will really drive their attitude on what is acceptable and what's not. And for many of them, you just better have, like we talked about, the legality straightened out before you ever start. For us, we write both what Gail writes under her name as well as the Portal Fantasy that I did. It is not based in a specific gaming system. And part of that is when you are creating your creatures, or if you're calling a spell, you need to make sure that it's not in that gaming system, or that it is part of history, part of theology, or something out there that you can name from multiple sources that's not particular to a gaming system. So anything you think is unique, such as a gelatinous cube, you best not use unless you've got permission to do so. But if you've got a vampire, that is generic and used in multiple genres, except you will still get people that come back to you and say, real vampires don't do that.
Oh God, try writing vampires. Real vampires don't. Oh God, I just heard the word real vampire.
Oh, goodness.
Actual conversations I've had as a vampire writer.
Well, the fun conversations you can have in the hotel bar. So
Alcohol helps.
oh, yes.
Yes.
So
But
what
yeah,
about-
like a lot of balls of fire instead of fireball, if you know what I mean.
But to me, I use Fireball obviously as an example because that's kind of across systems, but to me, that's generic enough.
That one is, but you have to be. I was just using it as an example. Like
Sure.
instead of saying fireball, which is exactly how it's written, it's a ball of fire. It's the Dr. Thunder versus Dr. Pepper argument.
Mhm.
And it also depends on how you're using it. Like if you incidentally say someone casts a fireball,
Mhm.
that's not going to get you in trouble but if you imitate exactly how, say, Ken or Ryu from Street Fighter does the hama and then puts forth a ball of fire, one could argue that you are actually imitating a specific intellectual property. So it's the more
Interesting.
detail and the more you use it as a main plot point, the more careful you have to be.
Yeah, and I'm gonna invoke his name now, and I heard you can only do that 3 times before he appears behind you, especially if you're in a bar. But Robert Bevan's style is to do Cavers and Creatures, which is to flip it and do his own thing, which is highly recognizable, but it's still unique.
And remember, if you do invoke that particular creature, he will clean out your liquor cabinet.
Especially if you have cheap booze.
Yeah, especially the cheaper the better.
Yeah,
Yes.
any vintage Kirkland Light is gone.
Oh, R.I.P. Kirkland Light.
So as we dive a little bit deeper in this idea of working with IP, especially the idea that we all have done work within our own systems, how closely do you leverage what would be considered the kind of the basic rules of the systems so that you're working with something that feels familiar enough, but not so familiar that, certain companies with, whose name rhymes with D&D is going to come down and protest. So what about you, Emily?
Well, since I'm a little bit of an outsider, I rely heavily on just the tropes and the highly recognizable, like races, classes, things like that. I don't go into the mechanics because that's not my forte. But I will jokingly refer to things like charisma, high charisma, or if Brandon Thighmaster pulls off this amazing physical stunt, it's clear that he's rolled a natural 20. So I'm using these things that I am familiar with as an outsider and incorporating them into how I write fiction. So it's a superficial layer for me, but enough to make people laugh, just enough.
What about you, Paul?
Yeah, I sort of fall out. I haven't written any what I would call LitRPG. I am Steve, my writing partner, and I are working on something, which I mentioned last time. Which right now we're calling it Delvers Inc. or Adventurers Inc. Obviously, I think both of those are taken, so we'll come up with something else. It's just kind of
Adventures Inc. is 100%.
Well, I know there's Acquisitions Incorporated and stuff
Yeah.
like that. So we will, if we ever finish it, because it's kind of one of those side projects, we'll obviously come up with a different name. But in that one, we sort of specifically, when the guy, our hero is doing his interview, the guy specifically is like, well, what skills do you have? Well, I can climb a wall, and 4 out of 5 times I don't fall. So I'm specifically referencing certainly first edition D&D. back when you rolled percentages for climbing walls and stuff like that. My other comedy, well, my fantasy novel is sort of its own thing. I've tried to come up with a system that I think is unique enough. I mean, it still sort of relies on things that people know, but the Dwarf Detective one, Spade Case Files, certainly you can find references if you look hard enough. I mean, there's, the invisibility spell requires a diamond, worth 10,000 gold, which I think is, if I remember right, is a D&D thing. I don't think it's specific enough to get me in trouble. At least I hope not.
They would have found you already.
Exactly. Yeah, but maybe I should wish they would, because then people would be like, "Oh, we should read that." Controversy breeds sales, right?
Totally.
But yeah, then otherwise it is kind of like Emily said, you sort of fall into the tropes that people already know. I mean, D&D didn't invent halflings and elves, and that was Tolkien all the way for a lot of that. So you do sort of play with the tropes, but then try and put your own spin on it. So people, okay, well, I recognize it as a D&D creature or whatever, but there's enough different about it that, okay, he's not totally stealing from WotC or TSR.
Rachel?
Well, a trope is a trope is a trope. They're tools that writers use. I mean, nobody looks at a romance writer and goes, "Oh, you shouldn't use a meet cute." If you're writing lit RPG or even a lot of epic fantasy, there are certain expected things. I would say for a lot of lit RPG, it's the unlikely hero. It's almost always the hero that's a loser in real life becomes the greatest in the virtual world. There's almost always a thief with some level of sarcasm, and dwarves always have Scottish accents. Like, these are just things. These are things that are expected. So it's like a toolbox. You pick the ones that you need that will help people get familiarity, and then you tweak and change, and you can also use those tropes to surprise people. I mean, it's just part of your arsenal. And sometimes, particularly when you're doing comedy, is using those tropes. It's like how Airplane works. It's every trope of the disaster movies, and just at the last second, tweak.
Yeah, you give them the expectations and then kind of twist it. And that's what makes the comedy, I think. Or even in regular epic fantasy, if you can take something that people are expecting. Vampires are a good example. My vampires can walk in the sun. Well, vampires can't do that. Well, mine can.
Real vampires can't, Paul. Real vampires can't.
Exactly.
That's why we have Mamiya brand sunscreen for vampires.
Yeah.
I actually have that. I have vampire sunscreen. Don't steal my ideas, Mr. Nettles.
Real vampires don't sparkle either, but she made tons of money, didn't she?
To be fair, I did reference that. That was brilliant fun. Someone glitter bombed my vampire. I'm digressing, but it can happen.
Sure.
Again, what got me in trouble was I have a scene where they're taking the vampire and throwing him out of a portal into the sunlight that drops off of a cliff. They fall into the portal, then they pop back into the tent at the top while they're going through and questioning the vampire. Somebody's like, "See, vampires don't sparkle." And he's like, "They do if you roll them in phosphorus first before you throw them out."
Real vampires, remember, real vampires don't do that. Like our new catchphrase for this panel redo.
What about you, Larry? Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, something we haven't talked about is we were focusing on writing in a game world where you're trying to do it without sort of the buy-in of the gaming company. And while I have not directly written in a gaming universe, I certainly know enough to be dangerous from some projects and the people I know. And that is that some of the gaming companies, they actually contract you to write in their world, and there are definite requirements that go along with that, starting with you have to read an incredible amount of background material and everything written in the universe that anyone else did, whether they were good or not. And for some, that can be not only using catchphrases, but also a style and language that you have to mimic when writing in their world, so that the reader doesn't know that you wrote it. You sound like every other person they had write in their world. So actually writing in licensed property has a very different feel and approach because they set very strict parameters on what you can do, how you do it, and the veto rights that they're going to make you rephrase, say, oh, a character in our universe wouldn't do that. You'll need to change this. So just want to point out that when you're actually writing in a licensed property, it's not even the same as writing in someone else's universe. Writing in a licensed property, there's so much more scrutiny on exactly how it has to be done.
And a lot of lack of editorial control. Because I have seen those, I like you, I know enough to be dangerous, and I've written in other people's worlds. It is definitely like you hope you get some leniency, but in the end they can tell you, no, you have to kill that character, or they have to end up together, or you cannot say the word kitty wampus.
Yeah. And you also have to understand up front what you're getting out of it as a writer to decide whether or not it's really worth it.
These are fair points. Yeah. Like when I wrote the Brandon Thighmaster story with Steve Wetherell, he's from the UK. He has a very distinct voice, way of speaking, phrasing, and people are very familiar with it, the people who listen to his podcast. So in a way, it feels like being not a ghostwriter, but even a method actor in some ways. Like I read back over some of the passages and I'm like, well, did I write it or did he write it? And am I allowed to laugh at it? Because it's kind of funny. I'm going to assume he wrote it.
And I will say, you looked fabulous wearing the golden briefs. So as we now look at it and talk a little bit more about it, how much, because I mean, I think part of the idea of LitRPG really is to have fun with it. You've got to have fun with it. You can't take it but so seriously, or you're taking it so seriously you're almost making fun of it yourself. So, what's kind of your preference? Do you really want to be breaking the fourth wall where the characters themselves are almost know they're sucked into a universe and they're sitting there going, I'm surrounded by NPCs and I'm dealing with this? Or do you want to play it a little softer where it's the question of, are they in a real world or not? So, all right, Rachel, we'll let you start with that one.
Well, when I wrote LitRPG, it's very clear, like the person's in a game world and they know they're in a game world. I mean, one of the characters talks about hacking it and like, oh my God, you're modding something that's connected to your brain. So when I actually did pure LitRPG, I went for comedy. I tend to have the questions about what is the nature of reality in my serious stuff, where people go, what? Oh, no, that's my normal jam is questioning reality. So when I actually did LitRPG, I was very transparent about the whole thing, because that's fun. And there are people who write, like I have talked to a lot of LitRPG writers, and there are two breeds. There are those that are very tongue-in-cheek, and like in a lot of epic fantasy, there are very serious. There's actually like grimdark LitRPG. And boy, those are some interesting conversations. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's interesting.
What about you, Larry?
I think it depends on the story you're out to tell. My preference is to go with a character-based story where the characters themselves are human and their own foibles are part of what make them funny. It's how they interact. They're taking their strengths to the extreme to be weaknesses, that kind of thing that builds the plot. I think you can have fun and do any of the others as long as when you set out writing your story, you know what you're going for and you're consistent. So if you want to write it, as Jim, you said, super serious to the point where it's funny because they're taking themselves so seriously, you can do it. You just have to make sure that's your idea up front, and that's what you stick through all the way to the end of the story.
Emily?
I have only broken the fourth wall once, and that was in the Fandango story. In the beginning, when he's born, there's a little gnome midwife creature, and her name is Emmy, and that's me. I helped bring his character into the world, so that's my only actual nod to what I'm doing.
Paul?
I think It just occurred to me that the new Jumanji is actually lit RPG to a certain extent, isn't it? I don't know why that just popped into my head, but I think
It was the pop-up screens.
Yeah.
exactly. I think I would write it. Well, certainly the one we're working on is much more humorous. I tend to like humor for those sort of things, again, because as we discussed the first time around, the role-playing games in and of themselves are inherently not terribly serious. Certainly not the certain ones. I mean, there are ones that, yes, you can be very serious with. Knights, Black Agents. There's an old one I used to play. I can't remember what it's called, but it's Stalking the Night Fantastic. So things like that you can obviously take very seriously. But I think Dungeons and Dragons, Rollmaster, GURPS, any of those kind of are inherently silly just because of the nature of what you're trying to do with them. But I do think there could be, and I just thinking about, I think there could be a case to be made for telling a really serious story too. And it's certainly possible someone's done it. But, if you got a group of, have they? I mean, because if you've got a group of, 15, 16, 18-year-olds playing, and suddenly they're thrust into this world and one of them's killed, that becomes super serious real quick. so a case could be
Stranger Things, right?
Yeah, that's a very good example.
Yeah, you're right. I guess, yeah, exactly. So along those lines, but that even sort of is not as deep as I was thinking. I mean, if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, let's face it, if we were all playing in Forgotten Realms and suddenly we found ourselves standing in Waterdeep, we'd be like, holy shit.
I would not drink the water in Waterdeep.
Yeah,
that's the first thing, because there's always mind flayers in the water.
I mean, but you'd be like, it's cool to play, but I don't know that any of us would want to be thrust into that world with the skill sets we have currently, because it would be bad news. But yeah, I think if I'm going to write it, I'm going to make it humorous, just because that tends to be my bent anyway, is sarcasm and humor.
So let's talk a little bit about, if somebody was wanting to get in to start writing lit RPG, what are the tropes that are kind of you gotta have, no matter what the world is, the universe is? What's your favorite tropes to play with in lit RPG? Larry, I'm gonna throw that one to you.
Yeah, I don't have a lot. I think probably the first one that comes to mind for me is the thief. I mean, it's sort of the classic. I also often think of the thief as the comic relief. Even if the thief is a little bit on the selfish evil side, that's still a catalyst for an awful lot of your adventure.
And I'll make note here, usually when I play, and it's been a while, I'm playing a gnome illusionist thief.
It's very fitting.
I can't unsee that now. Thank you.
With a Scottish accent.
No, you're not a dwarf. You're not a dwarf.
We make the dwarfs French. So Emily, what about you? What are your favorite tropes?
Well, I'm going to go with the bard storyteller, not just like the the hoe, but more like the Witcher bard, singing the goofy songs, strumming the guitar,
Plus a coin to your Witcher.
Yeah, telling the
Oh, it's
story.
in my head.
What about you, Paul?
I like, it's funny, you talk about dwarves have Scottish accents, but Spade, the dwarf in my Spade case files, doesn't. He has more of the gruff Philip Marlowe sound to him. But I enjoy dwarves. I enjoy, he makes constant fun of elves, just elves, they can't pass a dandelion without picking it. So definitely sort of the elves being the kind of flighty, playing in the forest, somewhat effeminate type people. And orcs. I'm a big fan of orcs. I love playing half orcs, orcs. So I have a lot of fun with those too in Spade's world, because again, they're sort of they're the bad guys, but not really. They just kind of got sucked into it by happenstance. So that's one of those I do like to play with and kind of tweak is elves. Orcs not necessarily being inherently evil, which I guess the new versions of D&D are kind of going that way with a lot of their evil races now, is that they're not evil per se. It's just that's the perception that people have of them. So,
Like accountants.
I
So,
think
Rachel.
someone complained they were being stereotyped.
what's that?
There were complaints they were being stereotyped, and I think their union might have
Oh,
filed.
that's right. Well, it's funny you say that. I just sent John Scribe of Destiny, which is my next humorous thing, and the dwarves in that are all unionized. So they all have unions in the world that they live in, and I'm a union member. I'm a union stagehand and film person, so I have zero issue making fun of unions, and I do it pretty mercilessly in that book.
Oh man. Well, it's an RE Carr book if elves are assholes, because like that's my jam. Sorry in advance, Emily. No, but I am perpetually the difficult gamer. I am the person who plays the half-orc barbarian who is in anger management classes because she doesn't want to ever lose her temper. I tend to do the antithesis character trope, which is for everything you assume something will be, usually my character is the exact opposite. So the mage is kind of thick, or the fighter is hypersensitive, because nothing is more fun than having a huge fight with an emotionally vulnerable, angry person. And obviously the elves are still assholes, though. We don't change that. But no, I love being that one person in the gaming group who is going to look at like, oh, I would like to be a drow who loves sunshine and flowers, and I want to be gentle and for equal men's rights, that sort of thing. It's just, there is the anti-trope, I guess, and that's my jam.
And now there's an elf out there writing your name down.
Mm-hmm.
There is true. Oh, there's
Who
a
wants
long
to be a
list.
dentist?
Right?
Spoiler alert, Emily and I are working on a book that has elves. Guess what they're going to be?
So working from that, let's actually dive a little bit, because I think one of the things that becomes important is the magic systems, because most LitRPG, it does involve a lot of magic in some way, shape, or form, even if it's technology. So even if you're doing a sci-fi LitRPG, it's still a magic system in some way, shape, or form. So how do you go about creating it, crafting it? I mean, we talked a little bit about how we may borrow heavily from other systems that exist, but how do you really go about taking it and making it your own, and making it so that it feels real or not so real? Paul, I'm going to stick you with that one.
Well, I mean, if you're doing a LitRPG, you sort of, you take the system as given and run with it. Again, sort of maybe not filing off the VIN numbers, but certainly sanding them down so they're not quite as obvious as what you're taking it from. But if you're sort of creating your own system, I mean, obviously there's a whole panel to be discussed about that. But you have to take what you like and kind of what makes sense for what you're trying to do. Because I mean, most RPGs, the magic system they have aren't very, I mean, they're cool, but they're not realistic, for lack of a better word.
Real vampires disagree.
Exactly. I mean, because there's all sorts of different styles of magic. I mean, there's the magic that requires a sacrifice. There's the magic that like equals like. So if you want to cause harm, you hurt yourself. Whereas, magic systems in games tend to be, oh, okay, you have these many mana points, or you have to know this spell and you know it once a day and then it's wiped from your brain. So if you want to go with that, you have to stick with it, knowing that's kind of the system you're going to go with, and accepting the somewhat inherent inconsistencies in it at times. Whereas I think if you're going for something that's not totally lit RPG, you definitely have to have an internal consistency to it, or people are going to call you out on that too. Vampires being an example. If you decide your vampires don't walk in the sun or can walk in the sun, then don't have them suddenly, get burned because they step out into the sunlight. Now, obviously that's an extreme example, but you gotta, lit RPG or not, you have to stay consistent within the framework you've set up.
Ms. Carr.
Well, the rule of thumb in writing, it's better to be consistently lame than inconsistently awesome. And with Magic, there's no difference. A lot of lit RPG is based on a game system. So I find that for that, a lot of it is very mechanics based. It's very logical. It's something that's digestible. So you have spell slots or you have mana pools. That just lends itself overall. There are other Magic systems in other genres, like you could go everything all Sanderson, crazy mystical Pokemon meets Roman Legion levels to very like willpower based. You can form anything, or you can go Witcher, where all magic is sort of in a careful balancing act. So there's lots of different systems, everything from the super fuzzy to the exceptionally granular. I have 3 spell slots. I can use them every day. And whatever you choose, just keep it. And, like Paul said, if you do keep it, you won't get called out. You cannot have your vampires who walk in the sun suddenly get incinerated unless somebody has some napalm. And the last thing I have to add is if you are ever going to break a rule, there has to be a reason, and you can always only do it once. Or the rule has to be broken permanently. You can have the act of breaking that rule be part of your story, but then it has to stay consistent afterwards. Like you can't resurrect the same character twice. It's that kind of rule.
Unless you resurrect them every episode.
Was
This is not supernatural. Thank you very much.
it the Belgariad that had the will in the word, where you could, as long as you had the willpower and you could say what you wanted and it would happen?
Yeah, that's the reality blending. Like your willpower becomes greater than the universe. That's like the super fuzzy end of magic versus your, I have 650 mana points and I have to spend them here and here.
Exactly. I have 1 cricket, so I can cast jump 1 time.
Correct.
What about you, Larry?
I think consistency, as everyone's already said, is probably the most important. Beyond that, if you're using a gaming system, the other thing it adds are limits. Because if you're using a gaming system, there should be a cost or a price to pay, and there is a structure which sort of holds you back and doesn't let you just do anything you want. Mm-hmm. If you don't follow a gaming system, then you've got to put that in where using magic costs you and you don't have unlimited power, and you have to figure out and sort of document for yourself, how is it structured that I can only do so much? One of the phrases I've often heard writers use is God in the box, where you have someone who can, or even worse, unexpectedly do something so miraculous and powerful, and it just throws the reader right out of the story. You don't want that. You want your magic user, spellcaster, wizard to have to fight and struggle to win and get everything done to make it more believable. And it's got to hurt. If it doesn't, then where's the challenge?
That is exactly,
why didn't everybody do it?
That is exactly what I was going to say, is you have to have balance of power. You can't have the overpowered character or it becomes super boring. You can't have Zeus,
AKA Superman.
Yeah, Superman and Zeus without some kind of major flaw or limitation on the power, or there's no struggle. Like Zeus is a major a-hole. He can't control his urges. He's a horrible ruler, and he's having, golden showers and children everywhere, rain, showers,
and likes to become a swan.
Genre.
Although, Larry, when you said God in a box, I suddenly pictured Lonely Island singing.
Oh, God.
Step 1, cut a hole in the box. Step 2, put your God in a box.
Now that's in my head. Thanks, Paul.
You're welcome.
Of course, with Zeus, it's a very appropriate song. It's pretty much his theme song.
True.
Now I'm thinking, don't forget consuming, eating, turning lovers into flies.
Yeah.
He's done it all.
Well, we've been here for a while, and we've been on a little bit of a journey, and I just threw a natural 1, and the orc on the bridge has told me I made him feel uncomfortable. So what's the one thing that all of you guys, each of you have that we might not have talked about you would love to share about LitRPG. So let's spin the dice. And Larry, since you won the spin earlier, you can go first.
Yeah, and the last time I had a great idea, we've already covered it, which is really watching your licensing. And I'd say this time what I'm going to go with is, regardless of what universe you write in or the story you're telling, make sure it's an appealing story with characters that your reader can identify with. And especially if you're doing an ensemble cast, make sure you have a diverse group that can pick up multiple readers and play with them working together so you pull the audience in to enjoy the adventure.
Rachel?
Well, I am going to do a replay from the unseen episode, the lost episode of the podcast. I would love to see reverse LitRPG, where it's like the opposite of Crocodile Dundee. So instead of the people going in the world, I would love to see the characters brought into the world, like our world, and to see what happens when basically Conan has to deal with a toll booth. I predict an axe will end up being involved. Or maybe turn it into a romance where it's like running off with the paladin who I've always wanted. He can be my, lawful good. That sort of thing. Like I would like to see more fun with the reverse, because just bringing, as much as we bring normalcy into these fantastical worlds, bringing a little fantastical into our world. I mean, it's a very urban fantasy concept and that's my jam, but I'd like to see more of it, and I'd like to maybe one day write it. You heard it here. In repeat.
And you also heard that R.E. Carr has now promised you a LitRPG romance. So, Paul.
Let's you and I work on that together, Rachel.
Where's a lot of Scottish accents?
Damn it. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really have a whole lot to add to sort of what we've discussed. Again, just if you want to write our LitRPG, make sure you choose a system that you understand, that you can explain to the people who are reading it. And if you are going to, start stepping into IP world, make sure you have permission, or again, you file the system down enough that, everybody knows what it is, but the lawyers can't specifically say that's what it is. So just be careful with it. And really, if you're going to go to that length, I would almost just say, just come up with your own system, or, come up with enough of a difference, have your characters playing papers and paychecks, which I think was one of the cartoons in one of the old D&D books, where it's like a dragon and some elves sitting around talking about having to pay bills and have a job. So, but come up with your own idea loosely based on a game system that everybody knows exists.
And Miss Kaplan.
Well, with a lot of writing, know your audience. Who are you writing for? Are you writing for people who are, intense, serious gamers? They want a laid out system. They want rules, they want consistency. Are you writing for people who are expecting a fun, light satire? Do they want drama? Do they want, just make your market pitch in your head before you get going.
We're sort of on the other side of that. Write what you want to write, and then hope the audience finds you, or you find your audience yourself. Write what you enjoy, because I think I think we all know this. If you try and write something just for the market, people are going to see through it if you're not into it. I mean, I don't think I could ever write a romance. Someone could say, you'll make $1 million writing a romance. Well, okay, I'll try. But people are going to be able to tell that I just tried to write a romance because I wanted to make money.
That wasn't the serial numbers you filed off of that one. Well,
I would say research. That is the last thing you should write. If you're going to write in any genre, please read a little bit in it, experience a bit of it, because as much as you want to write what you want to write, you should at least know the sandbox you're playing in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To know what people have already done and what you can get away with, or at least, what you can sort of glom off of and make it your own thing. But yeah, definitely know what you're running into.
I know we're at the end of our time, but I have a bonus question if we could fit it in.
Sure, absolutely.
It's okay. Okay, my question to all of you is, if you personally were ported into a game, what skills are uniquely yours that you would bring to the group, to the party?
Sarcasm and an inexhaustible wealth of being an idiot.
Hold on, I'm looking for my lock picks. They're over here somewhere.
I was going to say, fabulous baked goods and
Yes.
the ability to talk my way out of most situations.
High
How about you,
charisma.
Larry?
Yeah.
I would have lists for everything we needed for every possible scenario and exactly who was going to carry it in what pack.
Order domain.
I'm going to be the
Order
first one.
domain.
I'm just going to be the first one to die, because I'm going to look at somebody and say something to someone inevitably, which I think I'm being nice about. However, they're going to look and take horrible offense. You know, I could come up and say, "Good evening." Evening. Good. Do you see what's going on around you? And I'll be stabbed and dead in the streets.
By a
Either
real
that-
vampire.
Mhm. Either that
The
or
sparkles.
I'll drink and know things. One or the other. I don't know which.
Bard.
Bard.
A bard, illusionist, thief. Yes. I will steal your hearts and give a penny to your witcher.
Well, I guess that's better than stealing your pennies and giving your heart to a witcher.
They'd use it for some sort of ritual, and it would probably like summon a bog hag.
That's true.
I'm pretty sure
Or a
if you tried
French
to use-
dwarf.
Yeah, if you try to use my heart, pretty sure if you try to use my heart to summon anything, it's gonna just be a black hole. So
Or alcohol.
or alcohol, yeah. Well, I mean,
Wait, does that summon Bevan if we've mentioned alcohol now another time?
that's twice.
Yeah, you've said it twice.
Careful.
No, the reason it's going to suck the black hole. This is nothing but Guinness. There's nothing left but Guinness in that heart. And since we're coming up St. Patrick's Day, I'm gonna have to restock my annual supply. So I want to thank everybody for coming and hanging out with us this evening again. Except for Judy Black, who just couldn't be, didn't want to come play with us a second time.
Oh,
We missed you terribly.
She was busy. She still loves us.
Yes, I know, but I'm trying to make her feel guilty. So if you could let everybody know where to find you, Larry.
LarryandMartin.com. That's the site I share with Gail Z. Martin. You can go to either of us by our names on the web, and you'll find all of our sites, our social media, all the latest books, and where to find us when we ever go out of the house again, as well as where you can find our books.
Rachel.
Well, unlike when I write as RE Carr, my website is Rachel, RACHELE, Carr, CARR.com. And you can find me on Amazon and wherever fine bookstores are. Well, I can't even say that. You can also find me online as Total Recar, because if you understand that, you understand my books.
Paul.
you can find me at either paulbarrettonline.com or 2menandA typewriter.com, which is mine and my writing partner Steve's website. I've sort of, after I finished the Necromancer saga, I've sort of abandoned writing by myself because Steve and I work together so well that we've sort of, he's now even collaborating on the next Dwarf Detective book, which I wrote the first one, but he's helping on that one, and he's going to be helping with the other stuff I'm working on. So 2menandA typewriter.com will probably become the main site. Unless you want to see stuff about my cats, then you can go to paulbarrettonline.com, because that's where they keep their social media.
Emily.
You can find me at justthemwords.com, and that's M words. But I'm also a not so special guest anymore on the Authors and Dragons podcast, off and on, and the Calamity Janes podcast with Rachel, where we play D&D badly.
I think we play excellently.
I mean, really well.
Kevin thinks he plays excellently too, but
Oh, that's
Oh,
the
shut
first
up,
time.
Free.
No! Is he gonna appear? Hide
I'd
the
laugh like
deer.
hell if he suddenly appeared behind one of us.
as long as it's not my liquor cabinet, I'm fine. I don't have the cheap stuff in there. I'll be fine either way.
I don't have
So-
anything cheap in mine.
And I have been herding these cats and chickens. I have been your host, Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com. You can find me at authoressentials.net. And of course, here at ConTinual. Thanks, everybody. And we will see you again next time.
Thank
And
you.
hopefully there's not a round 3 of this one.
We're just getting weirder as we go.
I know.
It's Groundhog Day.